I endured years of humiliation and played the poor wife everyone laughed at. But the day Daniel announced a lavish engagement party for his mistress, he stabbed me in the back by presenting a predatory post-nup that would have cut me out of everything. I smiled while he spoke, but the truth sat heavy in my lap like a cold phone. I already had the keys they were trying to steal. My secret? I own the majority stake in the company Daniel built his ego on, and for reasons I promised my mother I would never betray, I never once showed a check or a title. My name is Eleanor Bennett, and I am 33 years old. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled their lives, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe toxic people always get what they deserve. But to understand how they ended up with absolutely nothing, we have to go back to the years I pretended not to see the cracks. I met Daniel at a networking event, him, charming enough, with a laugh that filled rooms and a handshake that felt like a promise. He sold ideas like warm bread. I, on the other hand, was careful with my mouth. My mother had taught me wealth was a quiet thing, a ledger, a lockbox, a trust you only opened for structural reasons, not vanity. When she died, she left me instructions and a trust agreement stamped in the kind of legal language that made bones of intent. Do not flaunt. Let character be tested. So I put on plain sweaters, learned to iron at 5 a.m., and let Margot Hale, Daniel's mother, call me names over dinner. Eleanor, she'd say in the way a woman sharpens a blade on a stone, you are so practical. Why waste money on shoes? When Chloe, my sister-in-law, sashayed past in silk, she made jokes about my thrift store coats. Once, in a winter storm, Daniel insisted I take the bus because we can't risk his company's cash on a valet. I stood at the bus stop with my coat collar up, while my mother-in-law rolled past in a leased SUV with a designer scarf. I learned to swallow that burn and tuck it into the ledger of memory. At home, I scrubbed, figuratively and sometimes literally. I managed the schedules, paid the utility bills from the one modest direct deposit I allowed into our joint account, and knitted every apology Daniel's temper needed. He called it my grounding sensibility. They assumed my quiet meant naivete. They assumed endlessly that poor taste equaled poor bank balance. What they didn't know? While they called me practical, I was a forensic accountant by training and a silent majority shareholder by deed. I had set up Silver Birch Holdings LLC the summer after my mother died, with a nested structure of trusts, Bennett Family Trust, EB Irrevocable 2019, and a series of clean corporate proxies. Those papers lived in my laptop behind two-factor authentication and a safe deposit box in the city. The ownership certificates, notarized proxies, and voting trusts that controlled Hale and Company were all registered in names that meant nothing to them, anonymity by design. I had a reason. My mother had made me promise to test people. If they loved me without my money, then gifts could be accepted. If not, the law would do what words never could. So I let them laugh. I let Chloe casually take my pair of winter boots from the mudroom because you never wear those. I smiled while Margot redistributed my grandmother's silver into the Hale china cabinet and made a show of how practical she was with family heirlooms. The house, the parties, the velvet rope of expectations. Daniel poured it, mouth full of praise for his own accomplishments, and I kept a quiet account of every insult, every unpaid favor, every demand. I also watched the company. I sat at the edge of meetings and listened, training my ear to notice when a line item bloomed suspiciously, when a vendor's invoice didn't match the job performed. I do my homework at night, 2 a.m. on a laptop under a kitchen light, pulling balance sheets and tracing wires. People think millionaires live everywhere at once. The truth is, a ledger has corners you can live inside. I memorized their payment patterns like prayers. I didn't tell Daniel why I declined the Manager of Employee Awards dinner invitations or why I refused to be on his arm at the opening of Hale & Co.'s new showroom. He thought it was modesty. He thought it was me being simple and grounding. Margot mistook it for lack of ambition, Chloe for thriftiness. They all misread the same book. The best kind of camouflage is humility worn so convincingly even you forget you are wearing it. I forget sometimes, but never when a spreadsheet breathes wrong. Greed is predictable. It repeats the same conceit. They believe whoever is quieter is collateral. The Hale family had bills, the big quiet bills that come with luxury lifestyles on credit. When Daniel's second round of investors asked pointed questions, and when Chloe's lifestyle left a trail from boutique to boutique, the family found a scapegoat: me. It was Margot who proposed the post-nup first. She did it at dinner, over carving, with the TV murmuring some mindless awards show. "Eleanor," she said sweetly, as if naming a casserole, "you should sign something. Post-nups keep things tidy. A small clause just to be sure my son's future is protected." Daniel smiled, like someone hearing a compliment. Chloe chuckled. They all did the thing the greedy do. They framed theft as prudence. That night, in the gleam of their champagne glasses, they floated a plan that was uglier than the tone it carried. Daniel, they decided, would marry Amber Collins, the 22-year-old from marketing, who had been helpful with his ego and terribly patient with his late-night calls. They wanted the house to be hers, the assets to be liquid enough to cover their credit lines, and most of all, a clear legal path to force me out or to coerce me into signing away any claim. They planned a move in stages. First, the post-nup that stripped marital property rights. Second, a petition for eviction under the claim I abandoned the home due to my supposed lack of contribution. Third, a push to have the limited inheritance I had from my grandfather redirected to an account they controlled, an administrative oversight that would magically cover thousands of dollars in family expenses. They thought the bureaucracy would be on their side. They were counting on their social capital and Daniel's charm to make courts and banks bend. They assumed I was weaker in documentation than they were in bluster. They assumed aloud that a woman who washed dishes in cheap gloves couldn't possibly understand wire trails or corporate hold structures. Greed, when you watch it, smells like arrogance. It also sounds like the clink of credit cards and the rustle of forged receipts. Chloe volunteered to be the public face her innocent niece act, we later discovered, earned them a sympathetic judge in a pre-trial interview. Margot called in favors with a mortgage broker she had helped out of a jam. Daniel arranged the date for a family meeting, Thanksgiving, when vulnerability is a mood and people are expected to be forgiving. They drafted the post-nup with their lawyer, a man with a soft smile and a soft conscience. They had the eviction paperwork ready, the checks to bribe a moving company, and the call lined up to Amber to announce the new arrangement. They were authors of a plan that would have left me with nothing and them with everything. They believed with the certainty of the entitled that there was nothing I could do to stop the stream once they opened the dam. They were wrong because they underestimated one thing. I didn't let any dam open without a dozen counter channels. I had been tracing the water for years. When I first saw the post-nup draft, my hands did that little thing they do when a surgeon studies for a cut. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. There is a moment in a room where every choice feels like a surgical instrument, cold, precise, functional. I took photos of the document, saved them in encrypted drives, and then I went to work. Step 1. Containment. I moved my personal assets where no single call could reach them. A series of transfers I had prepared in quiet months. Between Silver Birch Holdings, LLC, and 2 quiet offshore structures with compliant legal teams, my liquid holdings were immovable overnight. I created a fiat firewall that would make any quick grab impossible. I didn't do that because I distrusted Daniel, though I did, but because my mother's last years taught me money is armor when people aim for your flesh. Step 2. Evidence. I pulled every ledger I had on Hale and Co.S questionable vendors and cross-referenced with personal expense reports. The pattern was obvious: expenses labeled consulting that corresponded to Chloe's boutique shopping, duplicate invoices that routed payments to an account Margot used to pay her personal credit cards, an invoice for marketing that led to Amber's trip to Paris, paid in company dollars. There were wire transfers from Hale and Company to shell companies I had mapped years earlier, dormant LLCs with names like Sable Spring and Brass Canyon that had been activated with large sums and then drained into personal accounts. Step 3. Allies. I called Rachel Adams, my friend since college, licensed attorney, and a woman who kept her calm like a polished coin. I asked for one favor: a confidential forensic audit with subpoena power. She laughed once, soft and marveling, and then she worked. We retained Marcus Reed, a private investigator who owed me a favor from a case involving a minor shareholder dispute. He traced payments, recorded calls, and secured phone logs showing Daniel coordinating payments to Amber's travel agency with Margot's blessing. Step 4. Legal strategy. We didn't storm the door. We set traps. Rachel filed a quiet request for a binary discovery on Hale & Co. Documents that, once demanded in a corporate context, oblige banks and vendors to comply. She simultaneously filed affidavits establishing that I was an injured party to corporate fraud. We prepared a shareholder motion, a special meeting to vote on CEO conduct and extraordinary disbursements. The trick was timing and ownership. Because I controlled voting trusts, and because the proxies were assigned under conditions that activated when corporate governance was breached, I could call a meeting that would place the company on pause for independent audit. Step 5. Optics. When the family plans their Thanksgiving, there's always a photographer. There is always a circle of relatives, the smell of butter, the clink of crystal, and a man who loves being admired. I arranged for our family celebration to have a board member in attendance, Samir Patel, the CFO from an outside advisory board I had quietly convinced to join the dinner under the guise of being a neighbor. He would be there in a black sweater and an observant face. Marcus would bring the hard copies. Rachel and I would come as an olive branch, me, still in my quiet sweater, Rachel in a sensible navy coat, so that when we put the audits on the table, their reaction would be honest. Step 6. The financial instruments. I signed and notarized an irrevocable transfer that placed the deed to the property into EB Irrevocable 2019 Trust effective immediately. That trust had full instructions for management. Any attempt to sell or encumber the property without trustor approval would trigger automatic litigation and a freeze. I held the trustor capacity. In parallel, I filed provisional liens based on credible forensic findings, fraudulent transfers that indicated personal enrichment using corporate funds. I sent freeze notices to the banks that handled the suspect accounts. I also drafted new board resolutions. Using my majority vote via proxies, I prepared to call an emergency shareholder meeting to remove Daniel as CEO on grounds of fiduciary misconduct and to appoint a temporary independent director to oversee a forensic audit. That meeting required notice, but the proxies were already signed by dormant trusts that I had the power to activate. The law isn't poetry. It's a machine. I knew how to set the levers. Finally, step 7. The public setting. People who commit fraud in private are terrible at hiding in public because they want praise in both places. Daniel wanted his mistress announced at a family dinner where applause would make his betrayal into a coronation. He gave me the opening. I planned to use the applause as the sound their little house of cards would make when it fell. I didn't tell them any of this. I let them believe they had me boxed. I let them rehearse their lines and toast each other. Let them taste the first mouthful of victory. It makes the reveal sweeter. Thanksgiving arrived with a gray sky and a house that smelled like rosemary. Margot had outdone herself on the table, crystal and fragile platters spread like a fragility challenge. Chloe arrived in a dress so new the tag still had that fresh shop feel. Amber was luminous in the way privilege teaches you to be luminous. Daniel was in his element, king of the small urn. We sat. The small talk held the room like a paper ceiling. I kept my hands folded, the habit of the years of pretending to be humble. Rachel sat to my left with a napkin folded into quiet competence. Samir took the seat near the head, his face unreadable. Marcus sat near the kitchen door with a manila folder under his arm. Daniel rose to give a speech. He talked about new beginnings, and Amber beamed as if applause were oxygen. Margot winked at me like a woman showing a card. She expected it to be an ace. When Daniel finished his toast and the room's attention softened into the collective inhale of applause, Rachel put down her napkin and said gently, "Eleanor has something she wants to share." A murmur. I didn't stand. I didn't need to. I pushed my chair back, folded my hands on the tabletop, and let the silence grow into a room. "Eleanor?" Daniel asked, half amused, half impatient. "What?" I held up my phone and let the screen glow. It showed a wire transfer. It showed a vendor invoice labeled Consulting Paris Launch and a payment routed to an account whose name matched a shell company I'd traced to Margot's personal credit card reimbursement ledger. "I want to start with an accounting," I said, voice slow. "Not of money you think you took from me, but of money you took from the company you're supposed to run with integrity." Margot laughed, thin. "This is a joke." I tapped the screen. The room leaned in. "We conducted a forensic audit," I said. "Hale & Company paid for Amber's trip to Paris under marketing. Hale & Company issued duplicate invoices to Brass Canyon LLC for consulting that were then routed to Margot Hale's Chase private account. There are wire transfers from the company to Sable Spring LLC, and those funds were used to pay personal credit cards and an overdue mortgage on 14 Willow Lane, which, by the way, is under an account you withdrew from 2 months ago." Chloe's napkin moved. Her fingers trembled. Samir stood. He leaned over the table, quiet but severe. "We have the papers," he said. "We traced the transfers. We subpoenaed the vendors. These are not mistakes." "I own the majority of shares in Hale & Company," I said, letting the words land like stones. "My stock is held through Silver Birch Holdings and the Bennett Trusts. Those voting proxies are active. Today, I called an emergency special meeting to activate an independent audit. I filed provisional liens against accounts that show unlawful disbursements." The room scrapped like a body finding footing on ice. Daniel's face moved through colors like a poor actor trying new masks. "But," I continued, "there's more." I set the board packet on the table, hard copies of the audit results, the invoices, the wire confirmations. Marcus slid the manila folder so everyone could see the printouts. Emails from Daniel to a marketing vendor with directions to cover travel costs for Amber, a credit card statement for Margot with payments unusually covered by Hale & Company funds, an invoice marked duplicate with matching serial numbers. The documents were numbered. I had already had them notarized and time-stamped by an independent auditor. Their chain of custody was unimpeachable. "And the house," Margot whispered. "Eleanor, you can't." "I can," I said. On September 12th, I exercised a provision in EB Irrevocable 2019 that places the deed to this property into trust for the protection of company retirement assets and longtime staff housing. Any attempt to sell or encumber the property without unanimous trustee consent triggers immediate civil action. Secondly, I filed a motion with the bank this morning to freeze any corporate accounts linked to the suspicious disbursements pending audit. Margot's hand covered her mouth. Chloe's face went the color of old roses. Daniel tried to speak, to step forward, to make the charming apology form. "Eleanor, listen, it's not what it looks like. It looks exactly like deliberate misuse of company funds for personal benefit," Rachel cut in, razor flat. She read a prepared summary of findings, the total misappropriations, the dates, the recipients. "Under corporate law, these disbursements are actionable. We have names. We have wire confirmations. We have vendor testimony naming specific instructions from executive leadership." Daniel reached for the napkin then, as if a prop could shelter him. My hand didn't flinch. I had prepared for this theater. I had expected his flail. You think a post-nup can cover lying? I asked, and the laugh that came out of the corner Chloe's, high and nervous, sounded like glass underfoot. You filed for eviction papers based on the lie that I abandoned my obligations. You attempted to redirect my grandfather's bequest under the guise of an administrative clerical change. You've been liquidating corporate assets in little private puddles to pay for taste and vanity, and you thought I would not notice? Amber's expression was perfect for a social climber caught in a windstorm. She betrayed only surprise and a confusion primed for spin. Her phone buzzed, a habit, and she looked to Daniel. He looked back at her like someone who had been flipped from actor to accused. Then the second move. With a click, Samir announced that as acting independent officer, he was placing a hold on any executive expense approvals and that the board had accepted the petition for an independent audit. The room felt like a slow shutter closing. The microdrama mushrooms into an unmistakable reality when a lawyer places the paperwork on the table and says, "This is not negotiable." Rachel read the language of corporate bylaws in a way that made people who thought themselves clever realize they were merely unwise. Margot grabbed at me, an old woman's instinct to the child she had raised. "Eleanor," she pleaded, voice raw now, "we can fix this. We will return anything." "You stole from loyal staff pensions," I said, and every syllable was measured. "You used company funds as your private line of credit. You turned leadership into a slush fund. There will be restitution, and the board will pursue civil and, where appropriate, criminal channels. I will not be your wallet." Daniel's chair scraped. He lunged at me, intent on turning the moment into a melodrama. He would have made a scene, a spectacle. Instead, he left in a rush that made the silence into a physical thing. Amber flung a look, half betrayal, half recalculation, and walked out in heels that clacked like the last notes of a failed aria. After the room emptied into whispers, the lawyers took control. The auditor's preliminary report was marked sensitive. The banks processed the freezes. The house was still, an artfully decorated box with the sound of defeat as its new centerpiece. I didn't scream. I didn't gloat. Revenge, when well executed, looks an awful lot like grammar. Precise, unavoidable. They begged in the days after, like people who had misread a manual on how to be forgiven. Margot left voicemails thick with contrition. Chloe sent texts claiming ignorance. Daniel called at odd hours with apologies that smelled of debt collectors. They came to the front gate, Chloe once in a borrowed sweater, to ask for mercy, to offer the jewelry back, to promise all manner of small reforms. I listened and said the smallest words, "No." That single syllable carries more weight than any storm. It is a legal and moral bar. People who spend years eroding boundaries are shocked by their final absence. They asked for explanations, for meetings, for private dinners. I told them there were processes in motion. I would participate as counsel and as shareholder, not as supplicant. The company reacted as a company must. Hale and Company put out a statement acknowledging internal irregularities and promising full cooperation. The board appointed an independent auditor and enforced internal controls. The pension shortfalls were addressed in part by forced restitution plans, and where funds had been misdirected, legal action was initiated to reclaim them. That meant criminal referrals for certain transactions. It meant Margot would have to answer for knowingly orchestrating sham invoices. It meant Chloe's boutique credit line unraveled as bank investigators traced a pattern. Daniel, once a man whose ego swelled with a room, was stripped of titles and given an exit package hinged on non-competition and a generous but court-monitored severance that he could keep only if he did not contest the findings. He contested anyway, because arrogance is also an addiction. He lost in mediation. The court saw the wire trails, the vendor testimony, and the email chain where he gave explicit commands to cover Amber's travel. Amber? She vanished from the company record. There was no scandal in the press we fed. I chose to keep the matter primarily internal because humiliation is not the same thing as justice. Justice requires restitution. There are people in the company whose retirements I protected. I did not need tarred headlines to know satisfaction. The quiet restoration of people's security is sweeter than any public shaming. They asked for forgiveness in person once, Margot in my kitchen, a woman smaller than she had ever been. She said, close to collapsing into the chair, "I didn't know when I started, I thought." Her voice broke on the arithmetic of her choices. "I don't want your apologies," I told her. "I want accountability. I want the money back in the accounts it never should have left. I want the people you cheated to sleep again. If you choose to pursue that, I'll help you do the right thing. If you choose to denounce culpability, the law will do the rest." Chloe's future looked different. She had to file bankruptcy on some personal lines she had used as corporate rerouting. She learned what it was to be reduced to a credit score and, painfully, to do the slow work of rebuilding without the shortcuts she once took. In the quiet that came after, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and the ledger that had become my history. I was not unscarred. People leave marks. There were nights I still woke to the sound of their laughter as if it were a chorus. I had wanted love, and I had wanted honesty. I had not wanted to be a chess player, but sometimes life asks you to learn strategies to survive. I kept my promise to my mother in the sense that I never flaunted wealth to buy affection. What I didn't predict was how necessary it would be to use those instruments to protect others. My secret was a tool for justice, not for vanity. In the end, it was less about proving them wrong and more about proving the company and its people did not belong in the hands of people who saw everything as an opportunity for personal profit. The house remains in trust. The company now has a board with independent directors and a renewed fiduciary duty. Daniel's name is still on party invitations in certain circles, but in the places that matter to a life, loyalty, work, and safety, he is a footnote. If you're listening and you feel small because people decide to use your quiet as a reason to push you aside, remember this: the law has folds and seams, and if you learn the patterns of wrong, you can turn them into a net. Revenge, in the professional sense, is not theater. It is accountability enforced by rules the entitled hope you don't understand. I went back to living simply for a while because life taught me there is value in quiet. I also learned that boundaries are not a crime, and protecting the vulnerable is not revenge, it's correction. A year later, the staff at Hale & Co. threw a small, unofficial party for the auditors who stayed late and for the operations manager who had worked without overtime pay for a decade. I went and sat in the back. No speeches, no grand gestures, just people who had their lives rebuilt. Margot sent a letter months later. She didn't beg. She wrote an accounting of her mistakes and a simple line: "I am learning to be smaller and to make amends." I filed it with the other documents that proved a change in behavior, one of the things the court watches when considering restitution. I reclaimed my life by returning, paradoxically, to the things that made me human. Daily chores, the feel of a broom on the floor, a small garden I call my spreadsheet of bulbs and bulbs of promises. I learned that peace is the hard-earned product of boundaries upheld and promises kept. If you want the cold mechanics of how to set a lien, how to trace a wire, or how to set proxies, ask me and we'll talk specifics in another video. This story isn't a tutorial. It's a tale to remind you that silence is not weakness and that quiet competence can change the course of a life. And for those who think they'd like to be spared the work of justice, please remember, they thought they could buy everything. They forgot one thing: the quiet woman with the ledger will always know how to count. If you watched all the way through, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. If you believe toxic people should face consequences, hit like and subscribe. I promise more stories, satisfying, practiced, and, when necessary, merciless in the best possible way, fair.